Hello there, my name is Dr. Niamh Hamill and I'm delighted and honoured to be part of this presentation by Donegal Library's Decade of Centenaries 2021. I'm going to talk about women during the period of commemoration, and I'm also going to talk about what happened after that, how the promises of the new republic were delivered for women. I'll begin with a quote from a great revolutionary and feminist, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. And she said there can be no true democracy where there is not complete economic and political freedom for the entire nation, both men and women. Under the 1916 proclamation, women were given equal citizenship, equal rights and equal opportunities. And subsequent constitutions have filched these or smothered them in empty formulae. And that, unfortunately, is the state of play when we look at what happened into the run-up of the creation of this new and wonderful republic. The promises that were made to women, the promises that women believed would be delivered, and unfortunately the failure of the new republic to deliver those promises until very recently. It's wonderful that in 2021 we can say that we are much closer to seeing the dream of the 1916 republic being delivered for women than ever before. Many of us who did our history in school know about certain female revolutionaries that were involved in 1916. I think we all know about Constance Markievicz, and there are a few standout figures. And this spotlight on a few maverick women hides the fact that there were indeed many, many women involved in first and second wave feminism in Ireland and in between those two periods. And we may not know their names, but this collective activism that was operating from the 18th century onwards was very important in providing the kind of foundation that would see the promises come through much, much later than was planned. So I'd just like to have a look at the time periods of the various revolutions of women, if you like. And this is taking a different angle from our usual revolution story. So I guess what I'm looking at is our period of 10 years that we're commemorating now through the eyes of women and the women's movement. And if we go back to the 19th century, we can definitely see that there's activism going on in society, but it's a type of very genteel feminism. And this is typical. The same thing is happening in the UK and it's happening in the United States. And most of the women that would be involved in this would be wealthy, white women with a certain amount of agency. They would have benevolent husbands or fathers that would allow them make appeals for women's rights. Nevertheless, this is the beginning of the story, and the things that they did are very significant. As we move a little closer to the early 20th century, the nature of that feminism becomes more radical. These are the daughters, if you like, of the first wave of feminists, and they are more vocal and more insistent, and they have learned tricks of pressurizing people. And of course, suffrage becomes a very important topic. Back in the 19th century, women drew the line at looking for votes. They were looking for access to education, for example, and better supports for children. But they weren't agitating for the vote. But as we move into the 20th century, there's real pressure on to allow women to go to the ballot box and make their choices known. So this arises in the early 20th century in Ireland, of course, but it becomes very mixed up with the Celtic revival and this new sense of nationalism. And it becomes complex here in a way that may not have happened in other modern European countries at the time. And I think that this mix of nationalism, revolution and the women's movement, and indeed other movements, the labour movement, workers' rights was also an issue. And I think if we look at 1916 in detail, one of the reasons for its failure would be that there were so many different causes and maybe so many chiefs involved with their own agendas that it was very difficult to get a specific focus. So certainly in the early 20th century, the women's movement became victim to this confusion. As we move into 1918 and women do get the vote, things are hopeful. But then the sequence of the 1916 Rising, the War of Independence and the Civil War did really deplete the new republic of leadership. And I think that's sometimes one of the things that we forget, is that the dreamers who were around the table in 1916 and had this vision of a new republic, so many of them were executed. When it comes to the War of Independence, we have assassinations and executions, and indeed the Civil War. So it is the subs bench that's pulled out to form a government in 1921. And then, of course, because of the treaty split, many of the people who were elected to government would not take a seat or wouldn't participate in that. So one of the unfortunate aspects of the period when independence came was the divisions and the absences of so many people who'd been involved in the dreaming of it. We have the Constitution of 1937. That is really a landmark constitution. It's the second constitution of the Republic, and it is written almost completely solo by Eamon de Valera, but with heavy, heavy pressure on him from the church. And in it, that constitution really enshrines a doctrine that is very specifically Catholic. And this is really when we see women removed from the public space, removed from public life, removed from any role they might play in politics or economics. And this is to the detriment of society for the next 60 years. And it really does take until this decade to see the very stringent limitations that were put on women's lives overturned by repeal. So to just go into a little bit more detail of these phases, 19th century, between 1870 and 1912, we see that first wave of feminism, a kind of a well-behaved, gentle pressure. We then move into this era of home rule, which is really very interesting because of that dichotomy between nationalism and feminism. Home rule had been on the table for Ireland for quite a while through the 19th century, and when it seemed at the point of delivery in 1912, the Home Rule Party, and particularly John Dillon, was very keen that any moves towards home rule would not be distracted by a demand for women's suffrage. And this really divided the camp. Some people felt that it was essential that suffrage was part of the home rule deal. Others felt it was better to establish the republic first and then secure whatever the citizens of that republic might want. John Dillon himself was very much anti-women's suffrage. He said that he believed it would be the ruin of our Western civilization. I quote, "It will destroy home, challenging the headship of man laid down by God. It may come in your time," he said, "I hope not in mine." So it was quite difficult for the feminists of the time to make themselves heard. They were constantly being pushed back with accusations of not being patriotic and not supporting the great cultural and political movement of the time. Despite the absence of women's suffrage as a condition for home rule, there were many women's organisations that were set up in the first 20 years of the 20th century. Back as far as 1876, we had the Women's Suffrage Association. In 1900, we had Inian and the Heron. Cumann na Bán in 1914, the Women's Franchise League, the Irish Women's Suffrage Association, the Irish Women's Workers' Union, and the Irish Citizen Army. So all of these represented the various shades of energy for both feminism and independence and nationalism. And sometimes it's interesting to note that if you study political history in the usual patriarchal frame, which is, in fairness, the way we were taught it, we are very accepting of different groups and different opinions. We might look at 1916 and we see Pádraig Pearse, we see the IRB, we see Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin, we see James Connolly and Jim Larkin and the Workers' Union, and we are understanding of the fact that many of these people had different opinions. For whatever reason, sometimes people expect that all of women will be in one big umbrella organisation and they will all think the same way. And, you know, this is just something that has arisen because of the way in which we've learned our history. But women, just exactly like the men, had different ideas about what was important, whether they were putting the labour movement and class and workers' rights, over women's rights, over making it gender specific, or whether they were, like Constance, ardent nationalists first and feminists second. So we should expect to see a plethora of women's organisations, and indeed we do. Many women were involved in 2 or more of those organisations, and there was certainly a lot of community within them, but there was also a lot of disagreement as well about approaches, about theses and about theories. And that is something that needs to be understood, and we need to stop plucking out 3 or 4 trophy women and using them as an expression of what happened during the 10 years that we're commemorating, because it is more complex. It brings in all of the factors that we expect in other histories of gender, of class, of economics, of religion, of society, and we do it a disservice if we simplify it. When we get to 1916, and I think everybody's very familiar with the outcomes of 1916, and indeed there has been a very refreshing focus on the women who participated. But the thing to remember is that the promise of the proclamation was equality for the men, women and children of the new republic. And that was written down. And there were few places in Europe where that equality was manifestly declared in writing. So we had every reason to believe that going into the era of revolution and the era of freedom and the era of a new republic, that something fantastic was going to happen, something unprecedented in terms of European history, that women and men were going to share in the foundations of the new republic, in the creation and construction of it. About 300 women altogether took part in the Dublin Rising. About 77 of them were detained in the barracks, and you know, they were treated slightly differently than the men who would become the martyrs. Constance Markievicz was very annoyed that she was not executed. She said, "I wish your lot had the decency to shoot me." So again, we'll talk a little bit towards the end of the talk about how these women are remembered as participants in the Rising. Many of them delivered messages, they were spies. It was much easier for women to move around the streets and move in company where men might be either known or suspect. But you know, this tale of their involvement got very diluted in subsequent years, and they were very much reduced to part players. It's interesting as well that when the first award of pensions came out for the participants in 1916, women were not acknowledged at all as having played a part, but this was rectified subsequently. The First World War was also a significant event because on the one hand you had women aspiring to nationalism, you had women aspiring to women's rights, but you also had a lot of women who were married to soldiers who were out on the front, and they felt that their loyalties had to be to the soldiers, and that was a significant pressure on the delivery of women's rights. And then we have post-1918. After the general elections in 1918, famously Constance Markievicz is elected to the new government. She is elected to the Parliament in Britain, but she doesn't take her seat. She couldn't take it anyway because she was in prison at the time. But she does become the first female member of Parliament in the British, I was going to say Oireachtas, in the British Parliament, and decides then that she will take her seat in the First Dáil. This, of course, is a monumental achievement. It's very interesting to note that while women were given the vote in 1918, that vote was only given to women over the age of 30. But the age limit for men voting was dropped down to 19. So what this meant is the glut of women who were actually coming in to participate in the vote was counterbalanced by a new population of males. There was great fear that the apple cart of politics would be very unbalanced if women were given the vote. So it was almost an aim to neutralise the impact that women might have when they would vote. Women also played a strong role in the War of Independence. They were active agents during that time. The real disintegration that we see of female participation in the political process is during the debates on the Anglo-Irish Treaty in Dáil Éireann. With the defeat of the anti-treaty side in the Dáil, the women who were involved with Sinn Féin and Cumann na mBan divided into 3 sections: pro-treaty, anti-treaty and neutral, and the majority of them were neutral. Cumann na Mban reformed as an anti-treaty organisation and changed its constitution. So that really meant that a lot of the vocal women who had been in the process for a long time were silenced, partly by their own involvement, but then the constitution and the new laws would move in to silence them further. When we look at what happened after the establishment of the new republic, we see a sequence of laws that trickled in and pushed back the participation of women. We could look at the Juries Act in 1924 and again in 1927. Now, up until this time, women could participate in jury service. After these laws, women had to specifically apply to be considered for jury service, and they didn't. And really what that meant was every time a woman went up in front of a courtroom, she was going to be judged by 12 men. That obviously had an impact on the kind of sentences that were given and the kind of thinking that was behind the criminal justice system of the new republic. The Civil Service Act in 1924 also removed women from the workplace. The Censorship Act in 1928 also really limited access to literature, to information. We had the marriage bar in 1932, which, remember, lasted up until the 70s, which prohibited women from working after marriage. And there were various contraception bills from the 20s through the 30s which made contraception unavailable, information about contraception unavailable, and this had a serious impact on the lives of women. You may be interested to know that up until the New Republic, there was availability of contraception. It just wasn't defined. If you look at the imports into Ireland in the first decade of the 20th century, there are lots of items just named as rubber goods. And you also, remember, had a lot of more information than was permitted after the War of Independence. When this was being drafted, when contraception laws were being drafted, many of the doctors in Ireland expressed their concern about women who were at risk from pregnancy and appealed to them for some measure of access, you know, to these life-saving systems. But most of the doctors at the time were Anglo-Irish Protestants. The church deeply distrusted them and then put pressure on the lawmakers to ignore what the doctors were saying and do what the church was saying. And, you know, and this is a thread that weaves through Irish society for the next 60 or 70 years. One of the things we might ask ourselves is, how did this happen? How was it allowed to happen? So a couple of suggestions I will offer you. First of all, as I said, a lot of the visionary leadership that was there in 1914, 1916, 1918, 1920 was simply not there when a new government was established. The second thing to remember is that Ireland had been part of the British Empire for 300 years. The civil service, the health system, the education system had been set up as a British system, and there was an infrastructure there, or a civil service. Now, obviously, after independence, after partition, that civil service had to be replaced by an Irish civil service, and that was simply a huge task. And obviously, a revolutionary government were not looking to the British to help them, and the British certainly weren't willing to help, but the church was there, ready and able to insinuate itself as much as possible. And two major systems of this new republic would be healthcare and education. And so the church persuaded, agreed, cajoled, it depends on your point of view, but definitely integrated itself in the secular running of these systems. We have hospitals that are run by the church, and we have schools. Anyone over the age of 30 will know that the manager of every primary school would be the parish priest, and there would be heavy involvement of the church at all levels of education. So from the very beginning, this Catholic doctrine that was imposed on the new laws of Ireland certainly made a huge impact in how the Republic would be delivered. And then, as we say, Eamon de Valera had a vision of Ireland that was the antithesis of what had gone before. He wanted Ireland to become self-sufficient, insular, Gaelic speaking, Gaelic culture. And none of these aims are bad, and we can kind of understand why that would be the response from a country that had been a colony for 300 years. However, the fact that the Church and the Constitution were combined so tightly made a very hostile environment for those who were outside of that arena. Well, who was inside and outside? The 1937 Constitution made it very clear that the place of women was in the home, as a wife and as a mother. That is specified in the articles of the Constitution. What that meant was that women would be educated to be mothers, to be wives, to run households. The subjects that they were offered in school were domestic subjects. They weren't hired in career paths because it was assumed that as soon as they would get married, they would have to leave. Therefore, there was no point in teaching women academic subjects for a career. So they were diverted almost from birth. They were geared in one direction. And then you also had the problem of large families because of the absence of contraception. Divorce was illegal because of Christian doctrine. Abortion was illegal. Women had very, very difficult lives. If everybody lived in the ideal nuclear family of mum and dad and 9 children, and that worked out for them, well, so be it. But for thousands and thousands and thousands of people, that was an untenable situation. And what we see in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s are unprecedented levels of emigration. About 16% of the Irish population left Ireland in the 1950s and 60s. That is an incredible slice of the population to leave. And as you can imagine, the people who were leaving were the young people. So there was a vacuum where the 20-somethings to the 40-somethings should be. And of course, it is those people. They are the dynamic part of the population. They bring in change. They introduce movement. And when they were in the UK, when they were in the United States, Irish society, which was already pretty conservative, just became more and more static, conservative, immobile, and unhappy for the majority of the people. And you can see this in the literature of the time. If you read Patrick Kavanagh, if you read Brian Friel, you know, there are very few happy families. The ideal, the dancing at the crossroads, the mother, the father, and the large family was a kind of a romantic vision. But in practice, this was a very, very difficult life to live, and particularly so for women. Things, of course, did change. We joined the European Union, the EEC, in the 1970s. The Irish government had to amend a lot of their laws to address the problems of inequality. And so you had second wave feminism. You had wonderful people like Mary Robinson, who emphasised the need for Ireland to match other European countries in terms of equality. And a ball started rolling then that has brought us to 2021. I just would like to acknowledge that between the 1930s and the 1970s, even though the Constitution had limited women right back to the domestic sphere, there was a lot of activity within that sphere that served as a very formidable base for what would come in our generation. I'd like to note the Irish Housewives Association and the work of Hilda Tweedy and her colleagues, and also the work of the Irish Countrywomen's Association. I was listening to a talk the other day on the late Maimo MacDonald, who was an absolutely wonderful woman, and she described herself and her Irish countrywomen as homestead revolutionaries. And even though they didn't have access to politics or economics, through their organisations, through their gentle but insistent lobbying, through their participation on local boards, on school boards, they certainly paved the path that the new, more radical revolutionaries would take in the 70s and 80s. And we really owe these women a great debt. I hope you found this reflection on our period of revolution through the eyes of women at least thought-provoking. There is much, much more that we could talk about and that we have yet to learn about how women played a role both at this period of commemoration and subsequently. But one thing that I would like to say is that we are now at the point of remembering, and we are now at the point of commemoration. And for too long, 1916 has been seen as a male heroic event. There were women present, they were significant, and they need to join their counterparts when we celebrate. It's not just important for the memory of the people who are involved. It's important for our school children to learn that Ireland gave great example in 1916 about equality, and that there was a partnership working between men and women for greater aims. We could talk for ages about why they weren't delivered at the time, and maybe we can learn lessons from that. But to obscure that wonderful time of ambitious plotting for a great republic is to do a disservice to this generation and the last. We also need to relocate our use of women as cultural symbols, whether it is, the statues that we use. Somebody mentioned recently about the number of female statues in Dublin, and there are few, and those that are mythical or symbolic, or they're fictional characters. We need to make sure that we have real live women commemorated in terms of the art, in terms of the sculpture, in terms of the way that we remember these events. We are definitely moving towards a time where we have a more serious feminist critique of that period, and there are now many good scholars who are working very hard on this. We can't say that the women are invisible anymore, they certainly aren't. The strong women, the obvious women have become very visible through the work of these scholars, but there are now many unseen of, unheard of women, groups of women, associations, organisations, streets, clubs, and their part also needs to be acknowledged. I am very grateful to Jill Doherty in Bundoran Library and to Donegal Libraries for the opportunity to have a chance to have this chat with you, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.